Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here at Rocky Mountain Christian Fellowship. I enjoy coming down here, and as you know, I often come down here to just listen to speakers and interact with people, and it's a true blessing to be able to speak myself here to this place. It's been, hi Tim, and it's been a while since I've been able to speak again. So we're going to talk about the waters of the deep. Oh, by the way, I understand we're live tonight. So I want to say hi to my wife Linda in Brush and my daughter Lisa in Fort Lauderdale. Hi Lisa, hi Linda. So anyway, got that out of the way. Waters of the deep in the Ogallala Aquifer. Okay, go to the scriptures. Proverbs 8:27-28. I was there when he established the heavens, when he drew a circle in the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, and when he established the fountains of the deep. The Garden of Eden, one of the first places we hear a little bit about water other than the first couple of verses of Genesis. The river flowed out of Eden, to water the garden, and there divided into and became four rivers. Four rivers flowed out of Eden. They didn't flow into Eden, they flew out of Eden. It looks like an artesian water well system to me. But man messed it up when he sinned. And God saw the earth, behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. For God said, for I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy the flesh, in which the breath of life under heaven, everything that is on the earth, shall die. And of course, only Noah, his family, and the animals on the ark were spared. Then came the flood. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. The waters completely inundated the earth, so that even all the high mountains under the entire sky were covered. All the mountains. Mount Everest, that's always a classic question. How could Mount Everest be covered with water during the flood? There was no Mount Everest at that time. That's the simple, straightforward answer. The earth was so completely changed as a result of Noah's flood that anything that resembled a mountain or what it used to see and everything else was totally changed. When Noah took off, left the ark and walked off the ark and looked around, of course he looked out the window earlier than that, it was a very strange place that he was at. So, if the earth's surface were flat, then there is enough water in the oceans to cover a depth, to cover the globe to a depth of 1.7 miles. But where did all the water go after the flood? Right here, Pacific Ocean and other oceans. You look at this, you take a globe and sometimes look at it and just view the Pacific Ocean, and you can just barely see land surfaces on the other end. That is one long, and I have flown across that Pacific Ocean. I don't know how those 747s can stay up in the air that long. It's a miracle to me. 70 to 73% of the earth is covered by water. Well, you mentioned technical difficulties, Rob. We just did have one.
I'm sorry I mentioned that.
Yeah, I wish you hadn't said that. This computer just rebooted.
The online audience has it.
No, let's wait a minute. Sign in. Yeah, I did this the other night, too, at a meeting I was at. So, if you look at this graph, let's go back and make sure, yeah, I didn't get too far. If you look at this graph, you got to look at it and kind of figure out what it is. It's percentage of water volume, earth versus seawater, okay? So all this in the yellow is earth. Here's sea level, and here it is above the earth. So there's a lot more water, earth underneath the sea level than there is above the sea level. Then in this part of it in the blue is actually seawater. Okay? So you kind of get the picture here. There's a lot more volume of seawater here below the sea level than there is above the seawater. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the places that you appointed to them. So let's take a look at the next graph, how that might look like if you totally flatten this thing out. We still got the 1.7 miles of water, and there's Earth. If everything was flattened out, percent of volume of Earth versus seawater. God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth," at the end of the flood. God says a lot about water in His Word. The word water and water is used about 685 times in the New King James translation of the Bible. God created the earth. God's created earth is especially designed. Earth is the only known planet to have consistent, stable bodies of liquid water on the earth. This comes from the web. Okay? But what about water below the surface? There's still enough water in the mantle to fill the ocean at least 10 times over. That would be about 17 miles. That's a lot of water that's still down below the earth. So the scientists believe that they've discovered 3 times more water 450 miles below the surface than all the oceans of the world, all locked up as hydrated nodules. I have no idea what that is. I just read it. But it's down there. 70% or more of what comes out of volcanoes, 70% of what comes out of volcanoes is mostly water in the form of water vapor. There's a lot of history of man digging in the earth and establishing a well. Let's take a look at a little bit of that history. One of the first places you hear about it is in Jacob's well. And then we hear about, later on in the New Testament, we hear about the woman at the well, also known as Jacob's well. Okay? Does it exist? Does it exist? Yes. This is Jacob's well in 1912. It existed then. And you have 2 people here. You can see, I believe this is a woman. The picture is very unclear, even close up. And this looks like a man watching her carrying the load. There's probably something could be said about that, but I think I'll just let that go. This is what it looks like today. In the church of St. Fotina, it's in the West Bank of Israel. There's a lot going on in Israel right now. But that well is still there. It's the undisputed Jacob's well, and everybody seems to say it's ours. The Jew says it's ours, the Muslim says it's ours, the Christian says, and so does the Gentiles. Everybody says that's our well. At least they all say it's Jacob's well. What about wells in the USA? What about the biggest, the site of the world's largest hand-dug rock wall well? Greensburg, Kansas. Greensburg, Kansas was in the news, about 15 years ago? When they got a tornado through there, they totally wiped that town out with just a few buildings, including this place was wiped out. The tower was blown down, and this was a total mess. It pretty much looked like that about 15 years ago. So this well there is 109 foot deep, 32 feet wide, and it's dug into the Ogallala Aquifer. This is what it looks like today. Yeah, I walk down to the bottom, you pay $2 or something like that, walk all the way down the stairway, and you get all the way down to, you can't get all the way to the bottom, you get to a landing right about there, okay? And then there's a platform down below, and below that platform about 6 feet is water. It's down there, okay? The platform apparently contained a steam engine which drove a pump. And the pump then pushed the water up into that tank we saw in the previous picture. So that was the way it was history back then, and then that was in 1885. So that well still exists. The largest hand-dug water well, but that's disputed. There's another one someplace, I think it's Italy, that says, no, ours is bigger. So, whatever. What does the aquifer look like down below? I'll tell you what my daddy told me. I'm standing there, my daddy's working on the pump down in the hole. He's down here, I'm up here holding the flashlight. I'm supposed to be holding the flashlight, pointing at what he's looking at. You know how that works. You drift off and your flashlight's someplace. Hold that flashlight back over here. Okay. So while we're waiting, I'm waiting. What does it look like down below, Dad? He says, it's a river of water going under. Oh. That was my impression. That was in the 1950s. Okay. But then I learned it's not quite that way. It's like a big sponge. That's probably the easiest way to explain it. A big sponge. You still have the water pit goes down, and the sponge lets go of some of that water, fills up the pit, and then if you take too much water out of it, the pit's going to go dry, so you got to wait and let the water ooze back into the pit. So that's how it looks. So more like a sponge. I have up here front, when you get a chance, come on up and look at it, a number of pieces of rock, and this is pieces of actual Ogallala Aquifer rock. When you look at it, you say, I've been out to some cement dump, because that's what it looks like, just broken cement. Okay? So, the hydraulic cycle, all rivers run into the sea, according to Solomon, yet the sea is not full. There they return again, the hydrologic cycle. And this is what you see in the typical classic hydrologic cycle, all kinds of things going up, water moistures from plants and rivers and other things, and then it comes down in clouds and goes down into the earth, and it percolates down into the aquifer and starts recharging the aquifer, and some of it, where they're uncontained aquifers, it goes right back into the river. I believe you can see that when you get over to Ray, Colorado. All of a sudden the water comes out of the ground. I haven't confirmed this, but that's what I see. And I said, where would that creek come from? Because west of Ray there was no creek, and east of Ray there's a creek. So it's something I have to look out for. But Ogallala Aquifer rock clearly is on the bluff up above it. We'll have a picture of that in a little bit. Okay, definition time. Aquifer. It's a noun. Plural noun is aquifers. Pretty simple. It's a body of permeable rock which contain or transmit groundwater. Aqua or aqui is water in Latin. Fer is water bearing. So water bearing rocks, all it is. Pretty simple. Interesting, their name for water in Spanish is agua. Similar. Okay. Now let's look again at the different aquifers, a couple different aquifer systems that you can have here. You have the unconfined, which we showed in that previous picture over there where the water actually ran out into the river. You have the unconfined aquifer, and there's a confining bed. And then below that, you can have another confined aquifer, which we see in the Denver Basin, by the way. Okay, another one. And then sometimes you may even have another confined aquifer. But you always have these confining beds. And that confining bed is an interesting situation to me. How did they get there? What are they made of? And why are they there? I don't know all the answers to that, but I know God was a part of that. There had to be a confining bed when Jacob dug his well. If there was no confining bed, it just seems to me that water would have just kept on gravity based, kept on going down. God knew Jacob needed a well. Jacob poked around until he found water. Maybe God led him to that place, I don't know. But the water was there, and it was confined by the confining bed. And then there's other places that have further confining beds. So it's another one of those things, God taking care of it and designed by God. Another question. What kind of flood-induced system or process would have laid down these confining beds? I'd like to have the answer for that. I don't know. I've not seen anybody in writing. Maybe I saw it and didn't see it. All right, here's a picture of the aquifers in the United States. The aquifers are all over the world. These are just some of them we have here in the United States. The main ones we're going to be talking about tonight is the Ogallala, and here's the Ogallala Aquifer. It's quite big. It's the largest in the United States. It's the largest. The other aquifer is the Denver Basin aquifer, okay? And there's other aquifers, obviously, and we're not going to get into them, but this being our neck of the woods, we're going to talk about these. And this is what I majored on, was the Ogallala aquifer. I got interested in the Ogallala aquifer, and I said, so I went to the library, and I said, do you have any books on the Ogallala aquifer? And I didn't know what to look for, and this lady came around and says, yeah. She found this one. It's called Ogallala Blue. Water and Life on the High Plains. Okay? It's secular based, but my, they get a lot of things right in here. They make a lot of interesting statements which we'll be seeing in here, which are clearly directly related to God's biblical flood. Okay? So we have the Ogallala aquifer, we have the Denver Basin. The Ogallala is also known, by the way, as a high plains aquifer system. It's another name for it. Most of the time that's its official name now. And it's called high plains because it generally follows the high plains area. Okay? All right? All right, the Denver Basin is made up of 4 different aquifers: the Dawson, Denver, Arapahoe, and Laramie Fox Hills. Okay? And parts of Castle Rock pull out of that. I understand there's some issues with that. I'll tell you, you want to get in a conversation that almost doesn't end, is to have a conversation with a farmer up in Brush in Fort Morgan about water. You know, I tried to get into conversation and asked him about a few things, and pretty soon they can get real carried away real quick, because that's a huge, huge issue, and it's been an issue since the turn of the century, 1900s, late 1800s. Okay, here's an excerpt from the Colorado Water Exchange about the Denver Basin aquifers. The rock that makes up the groundwater aquifers in the Denver Basin are sedimentary rock deposited. This is where there's an error here, but you've got to read this through this. Deposited as beaches and river channel sands between 65 and 70 million years ago. Of course, that's evolutionary time frame. As an ancient sea retreated from the central Rocky Mountains rose. Okay, it's an interesting piece of information. These paleo beaches and deposited river channel sands create the geological formation that geologists have labeled in descending order: Dawson, Denver, Arapahoe, Laramie, Fox Hills, and etc. It's a fascinating article. As the ancient sea retreated and the central Rocky Mountains rose. The Colorado Rocky Mountain Exchange. Psalms 104, verse 8. The mountains rose, the valley sank down to the places that you appointed for them. Traditional geologists tell us that the aquifers were made up of multiple rivers making their courses and depositing their sands, and that's what they talk about in the book Ogallala Blue. That's what he brings out, because it's a secular perspective. There's no evidence of that. Dr. Tim Clary says that, and we'll talk more about that. Here's actually directly from Dr. Tim Clary in a recent presentation he made. He talked about the flood explains the extents of the Ogallala aquifer. What does it say? It's the Pliocene and Miocene, and I'm not a geologist, so I might be butchering those words. Am I saying that right? You got it. Pliocene, Miocene?
Good enough.
Yeah, everybody's saying yes, good. Okay. 174,000 square miles, parts of it in 8 states, 180 to 300 foot thick, up to 1,000 feet thick in places. A lot of sand and gravel laid down rapidly by streams. This is his slide, Tim Clary's. He definitely questions that, okay? Another slide of Tim's, directly from Institute for Creation Research. And one of the things he says, rivers don't spread sand, they make channels, in which he lays out in this nice, beautifully done piece of artwork here, where rivers, they leave channels of sand. They don't lay a whole half, section of the United States called the Great Plains section. That's not what happened. I love this slide here. It's called the Geology Transformation Tool, authored by Tass Walker from CMI in Australia. I really like this. This has helped me a lot going through, because you'll be reading some document, and they'll talk about the Miocene. They'll use all these words. They don't make sense to me. But how does that fit relative to Noah's flood? And this chart, which is readily available online, the Geology Transformation Tool, shows when the flood water was rising, and there's all the layers, the sedimentary layers that went along at that time. He's conveniently put in the secular millions of years in this column, okay? But also here, which is this is a revision, he's put in numbers of days of the flood, 150, 220, and finally 4,500 years ago was the end of the flood. So you have the floodwaters, you have the floodwaters rising, you have the floodwaters falling, and then finally have the post-flood. This is the Colorado aquifer that we have, of course, in our area here. And you see on this slide the Denver Basin aquifer, which is predominant there in the center of the slide, right here. And this is the Ogallala. It just stretches into the eastern part of the area. And this is where I live. There's Fort Morgan. I live here in Brush. And this is a little town called Yuma. And Yuma is right in the thick of the Ogallala, and their water level is down. We'll show you more about that in a little bit. So again, you have the four different levels or layers of the Denver Basin. And then you have, it's interesting, this is a water channel, so to speak, where we get our water for here in Brush. And when we moved, it's interesting, a little tidbit, we moved from Sherman, Texas to the Brush, Fort Morgan area. We'd settled in that area. And so during that time, we started going on the websites and saying, well, what are they saying about their own town, you know? And Fort Morgan didn't say a thing about their water. Brush says, oh, we have pristine water. This water is so really good here. And I thought, well, that's worth a try. So we went to a restaurant, and sure enough, the water is really good. We went to Fort Morgan, and oh, it was horrible. It was horrible. It was horrible. And so now they have a pipeline that comes from Carter Lake all the way into Fort Morgan. And they call it quality water. Very expensive for them. So water is a precious commodity out where we live. We'll talk more about Denver water too. Okay, so where does Brush get its water? It's interesting. This is Brush here, and there's Fort Morgan. You have what they call the Beaver Creek alluvial or unconfined aquifer right in here. This generally tracks along with the South Platte River. Okay, all right. So this is from the city's website. It says the city provides pristine water, and it is good water. It's not hard. From our very own water well fields. It is drawing from the Beaver Creek aquifer, also known as the alluvial basin. And we maintain 10 wells, 90 to 110 feet deep, 4 booster pumps, and two 2-million-gallon water storage tanks. And I had the pleasure of sitting down having breakfast with one of the guys that worked with the water department here a while back. And that's where they got the information, because they've been wondering, as an example, how deep are the wells? He says 90 to 110 feet. Another piece of information. Okay? All right? But the interesting thing too about the water where Brush water comes from, it comes from as far as 50 miles away. Now, if you ever driven 71 south from Brush going towards Lyman, you're continuing climbing up to almost 7,000 feet. And then you get to the top, you look over, and there's Lyman down below. That water comes from all the way from that hilltop, 50 miles away, to ultimately to our town, and what's known as Vega Creek. Okay? There's aquifers in Israel too. Israel, of course, being a lot in the news. There's 2 primary aquifers there, the coastal aquifer and the mountain aquifer. And of course, the Gaza Strip is right where the coastal aquifer is. There was something in the news the other day And I couldn't get any more information about it, but the war has torn up the water system, the natural water system, I think is the way they put it, in the Gaza Strip. And I'm not surprised. There's a lot of digging going on over there, looking for that. And you wondered where Jacob's Well is. It's right here in the West Bank, right there. I have some articles up front here. I only had a few of them, so those you want to read one, get one, or write down, and you can get it online, same thing. So where does Denver get its water? The primary sources are the South Platte River, which is on the eastern slope. Then the western slope are the Blue, the Williams Fork, and the Fraser River. Then there's secondary sources like the South Boulder Creek, Ralston Creek, and Bear Creek. Okay? So we look at that water. Where's it coming from? You got the South Platte River. That's primarily where the basin is. And then you have the Continental Divide that works its way down through here. Okay? See this here in the green? That's all the Colorado River basin. And that's where the water comes from that they put over to this side for Denver and this immediate area right here. The rest of what's left over goes down to the Grand Canyon. Ultimately, the Colorado River goes through the Grand Canyon, of course, but its headwaters is up here in the Rocky Mountains. 80% of the precipitation that falls, 80% of the precipitation falls the other side of the Continental Divide. I found that a surprising statistic, and 20% on the eastern side of the Continental Divide. So a lot of that water comes from across the way, across the hill. About half of Denver's water supplies come from the Colorado River, the Blue, Williams, and Fraser Rivers, which utility pumps over the Continental Divide to provide 1.5 million people to Metro Denver, about 1/4 of the state's population. Okay, this came from an article called "How Should We Manage the Drying River?" It's a fascinating article. I know for me, I've looked at it, it says, we've got an area in our yard that we just water and water and water. It doesn't seem to do much good, and it's bluegrass. Bluegrass sucks up water and doesn't like heat. We're going to convert it into rock. So I'm going to believe we need to conserve more. So where did the earth's water come from? Aha! Where did earth's water come from? There is two different stories. The secular people and God's word. Secularists, we'll give them a chance. From comets and meteors. Okay? No, they burn up at about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Do you think there's any water left in that comet when it's coming down? This is what the Bible says. The Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. This is the first mention of waters in the Bible. Talking more about the secular perspective, it says if the average amount of water on earth were a very generous 10% of every water-containing meteorite, okay, and every meteorite were 10 times the size of the supertanker shown in that picture there, 10 times, we'd have to have a minimum of 11.1 trillion meteorites required for that delivery service. Talk about a refute. Don't miss this point. Secular geologists have no real plausible theory on how or where Earth got all this water. And they are still searching and wondering and postulating, but no realistic theory. None. And as a sidebar, the missing link is still missing too. That's, we move on. When and how were the water sources developed for man to use? Secular geologist says, well, through slow, gradual change, including ancient rivers and ancient waterways. More than 20 ice ages greatly affected the water supply. We know there's only one ice age. Creation geologists, there's two parts to this. So part one was a pre-flood environment. The Bible describes the Garden of Eden, and a mist was going up out of the land. It was watering the whole face of the earth. Were there any rainbows? Well, that's a question that's debated. Was there any rain? That's a question that's debated. Some would say yes, some would say no. Okay? Garden of Eden. Some of you know Phil Budd. Okay? Member here at the Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship. He has a book called Earth and Cataclysm. And the first half of the book, it's really a good book. The second half of the book is really a good book too, but I don't understand it. It was over my head. But he talks about what the earth looked like at that time. And so I bought one of his books, and I got his signature, of course. And a circulating geothermal system, a circulating geothermal irrigation system, maybe artesian wells, possibly, and was potentially sustained throughout the antediluvian age. So, when and how were these secular sources, or these water sources developed? Through the slow, gradual change, this is sounded repeated, isn't it? Ancient rivers and ancient waterways, maybe more than 20 ice ages, greatly affected the water supply. Millions of years, of course, was involved. Okay, part two, the Christian perspective, the creationist perspective, the post-flood environment. Noah's worldwide flood caused a total change of Earth's surface. I remember, maybe it's 10 years ago, it was a news bulletin. We think we know where the Garden of Eden was. We think we've discovered it. No. It was totally washed away. There's no idea where it's at. I heard somebody say, well, it's probably in Ethiopia. I don't know where he got that. So anyway, Noah's worldwide flood caused a total change of Earth's surface. 1, the mountains raised. 2, the basins went down. 3, then they filled with flood sediment and water-absorbing rock layers. Let's go through that again. So first of all, the mountains were raised. 2, the basins went down. Then the waters filled flood with sediment and water-absorbing rock layers, kind of like Ogallala rock layers. Following the flood came the 1 ice age. At the end of the ice age, there were large areas of blown sand deposited in the low areas and basins. So, secular geologists, why were these water sources developed? Why were they developed, secular geologists? Well, they just evolved due to natural, mindless, random, and undirected methods over millions of years, of course. Biblical geologists have entirely, totally, completely biblical perspective on that. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts towards us. None can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet there are more than can be told. And one of my favorite scriptures, for you know the thoughts that I have for you, declares the Lord. And that's for me too. Plans for welfare and not for evil, to bring you to a good future and hope and future for a successful end, depending on your version that you read. Let's talk about the Ogallala Aquifer again. How did it form? Okay. Tim Clary says, igneous and metamorphic cobbles in the basal conglomerate of the Ogallala were sourced from the Rocky Mountains hundreds of miles from the west. Okay, let's look at that. Here we have the Ogallala Aquifer. And what do we have right here? The Rocky Mountain chain. Okay? Hundreds of miles from the west is where they sourced. Okay? And from the Ogallala Blue, the book I'm talking about over here. The Great Plains and the Ogallala Aquifer are tied intimately together. And this is the punch. This is what I like about this book. Because he gets towards the biblical perspective at times, and several times. And they were formed at the same time by the same forces. And they're largely coterminous with one another. The water-absorbent strata is like a sponge. It's made up of sand and gravel rocks and some the size of houses. And that's, again, out of Ogallala Blue. They was telling me that in their fascinating book. Here's some Ogallala Aquifer strata. This is actually, I was coming down off of Pawnee Buttes. And I says, what is that? Because it's exposed up there. And this rock that you see here is the size of a desktop computer. And it's the same, all this rock is the same color. It's all the same color, same as this stuff down here. So how did it get there? That was a question I asked. The answers to the Ogallala formations are from the Genesis flood. I highly recommend, if you haven't ever read this, John Wickham and Henry Morris, there's sections in there they talk about this. The significant sedimentary rock layers of the world are found in these geosynclines. That's a word he come up with. Large depressions in the Earth's crust containing very thick deposits. Then later, the entire geosyncline was somehow lifted up to form one of our great present Rocky Mountain chain ranges. It's on page 147. Then the entire geosyncline was somehow uplifted to form one of the, okay, I said that, didn't I? Okay, here's one of them right there, maroon bells. See the sedimentary layers across here? And they're finding insects and conifer trees, different things up inside these things. Okay, fossils up inside the maroon bells. Noah's flood sedimentary layers. And of course, most people know that there's seashells found on the top of Mount Everest. Fascinating. Mount Everest was originally a sedimentary layer. These seashells have been deposited and then was pushed up. Mountains went up and the valleys went down to the places that you appointed for them. So late in the flood year, late in the flood year, the water covered central United States. Okay? The mountains rose quickly and caused tsunamis. Basins were formed quickly. Water carried the sand and rocks laid down the Ogallala Aquifer, a geosyncline. And you have the Ogallala, you have the Rocky Mountains, where all that actually came from the west and deposited in this cavity in this earth where there was a low point and filled it up. How was that again? Let's take another look at this, and maybe a little more dynamic view. Noah's floodwater covered central United States. The mountains rose quickly, causing massive water surges. So we have the mountain beginning to raise. All right, the first thing that happens. As a result of that, you have tsunamis. Now we're going looking west, and we're looking at east. So consider ourselves right in the middle of the Rocky Mountains right here. So that's the first thing that happens. Things are happening also as far as mass water movements during the flood. The speed of the water moving on the surface of the earth during the flood is phenomenal. Phenomenal. In our area, our general latitude, it was somewhere around 100 miles an hour, plus or minus something. Up here at the pole is almost nothing. But at the equator, 1,040 miles an hour has been estimated based on the Coriolis effect. Coriolis effect. Okay? So, back to our example here. Sheet flow is likely speeding across, submerged across the continents at 100 miles an hour. No mountains are formed yet. No underwater basins are formed yet. The Coriolis force is causing water to move very rapidly, going from the west to the east. Okay? So then the future Rocky Mountain starts pushing up, and they're underwater where they're pushing us up. They're underwater. Okay? At the same time, just like the Bible says, Psalms 108 verse 4, a basin is created. Okay, mountains go up, basins come down. I don't understand that, but that is what's happening, and there's lots of evidence for that same thing, and we'll show you in a little bit. So the flood waters is running off the earth. Okay, a little bit later, we're seeing now, as the mountains push up, there's a lot of sediment and rocks and sticks and everything else, and big boulders that are dropping off into this underwater basin as it continues, as the mountains continue to rise, as the water continues to flow off. The mountains start protruding now. The mountains protrude above the waters, okay? We're still dumping sediment into the future Ogallala Aquifer, okay? And the flood water is going down, as you can see. And then finally at the end, which is where we're at today. We have the Rocky Mountains, we have the Ogallala Aquifer, we have the last phase of the geological layers sitting on top of it, and they put a well down there, they get water, okay? Near the end of the flood, uplifts of the Rocky Mountains, Appalachian Mountains, the Andes constituted truly a worldwide phenomenon for which, as we have already pointed out, secular geologists have no satisfactory explanation on uniformitarian principles. But this is just what the account of the biblical deluge would lead us to expect in the strata and harmonize perfectly with it. Dr. Henry Morris and Whitkins from the Genesis flood. What about the Wyoming basins? Here's a picture I took back in 2012 when Lynn and I took our little camper and we went up to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Got this shop. She was inside making sandwiches. She makes great sandwiches, by the way. She's making sandwiches probably for us. And then later on I discovered, you know, these mountains are 13,000 feet high, but whoa, Jackson Hole is 24,000 feet deep. It's actually a basin that deep, and it's just one of many in that state. Look at this. This is just a few of them. You have the Bighorn Mountains with a basin that goes down to 21,000 feet. These are 13,000 feet. You have the Powder River Basin where our coal comes from, okay? And a basin of 14,000 feet, okay? There's your Black Hills. You have the Green River Basin right next to the Red River Mountains and in this area. And the Laramie Range, and you have more basins. It's just amazing basins in that state. And look at this chart here. The Wind River Mountains are 14,000 feet, but the Wind River Basin is 23,000 feet in a hole. The Beartooth, 13,000, Beartooth Basin, 21,000 feet. Bighorn Mountain, 13,000 feet. Powder River Basin is 14,000 feet, and the same thing. A Wyoming state geologist, David Lowe by name, came to the conclusion that parts of Wyoming went up and went down a total vertical feet of 45,000 feet. Every basin or depression between the mountains of Wyoming is filled with the same level of flood rocks. The topmost layers are identified by conventional geologists as Eocene. Although separated by mountains and uplifts that were still actively rising during the flood, the similar nature of these rocks across all of these basins suggest a common origin. What could that origin be? The flood. You covered the earth with the deep. You covered the earth, and with the deep waters as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled, at the sound of thunder they took flight. The mountains rose, the valley sank down to the place that you appointed for them. Here's some slides here. It talks about the fiscal 2015 Ogallala Aquifer Initiative. People are very worried about the Ogallala Aquifer. It's going to go dry. We're all going to die. All these dire things. There are some bad things happening, and there is a lot of places where it is going very, very low. So Let's take a look at that. This shows Akron right here, and that's Brush is just right there. So that's where your Ogallala comes into the Colorado area. But also, it's up here, it goes west of Wyoming, the Ogallala, although there's no basins up in that immediate area right near that I'm aware of anyhow. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at a Google Earth view, and here you have Fort Morgan, Brush. I live here in Brush. And over here is Akron, and there's the Ogallala. Come right in through here. There's a few wells that are over here in the Akron area that are picking up, but when you get over here to Yuma, big time. A lot of wells, a lot of pivot sprinklers in that area, drawing water out of that, and there's more so as you go further east on that. Here's a close-up view of the pivot sprinklers and Yuma. You get something to drink here. Gotta have my Gatorade. Thank you. All right, excuse me for that. So guess where the Ogallala Aquifer got its name? Pretty simple, right? Simple? Ogallala, Nebraska, of course. Well, why Ogallala, Nebraska? Because this fella, Mr. N.H. Darton, who was very much a character that you look at his picture, that's exactly how he shows up in the geology field. When he would go out poking for rocks, dressed just like that. They thought it was a little bit strange. In 1898, when he discovered that formation near Ogallala, Nebraska. So when was the Ogallala formed? Near the end of the Noah's flood, when the mountains were simultaneously rising, all going mostly, and all this is going on mostly underwater. So a sidebar question I've got. Get a sidebar, not a question. There is, get a copy of Creation Ministries International, The Uplift of the Mountains by Tass Walker. It just came out just a few months ago. It's a very good article about that. And he says it happened quickly, but it didn't scare anybody. So kind of an interesting perspective. Another sidebar is, if you haven't seen it, is Genesis History, Mountains After the Flood. Anybody seen that one? Yeah, that's a gotta see. You've got to see that one. And it's now a full-length video. Here's a map that, again, is from Dr. Ord and Reed, that I really enjoyed this. It's really helped my perspective in understanding the waters of the flood. The water height is in relative height, but the days are in absolute days, strictly coming from the Bible, okay? So the eruptive phase started 7 days after they got on the board of the boat, the eruptive phase. And then at the 151st day was the water stopped rising, and the ark was grounded about that same time. And I keep thinking about the Coriolis effect and the ark being grounded and the ark moving along possibly 100 miles an hour, and it was grounded. Think about that a little bit. So then the water started coming back down, the water leveling, and that's, okay, the retreating phase, all right? Now we look at that a little bit more here, and that the water stops rising, the ark is grounded, the mountains are covered with water, okay? In the retreating stage, this is where the aquifer is being filled with water, sure, because there was a lot of water there. It was filled while it was underwater. So it was filled with water, and it was filled with the sedimentary layers and stuff that's in it right now. After the sedimentary layers filled the basins, several minor rock and sound layers were deposited on top until the end of Noah's flood. After the one ice age, a few more layers were deposited on top of that. So note for us, the actual ice age did not come this far south. Not where we live here in Colorado. Yes, there were glaciers here in the mountains, of course. But the Ice Age tended to hang around the border, Canadian-U.S. border, and it drifted south, and actually as far down as Lincoln, Nebraska, and outside of Lincoln, there's evidence for the Ice Age actually down there. I'd like to go over there sometime and take a look at that, what's there. So a quote from the book Ogallala Blue again, by Ashworth. The Ogallala is composed of ghosts of ancient rivers. Okay, we know Tim Clary says that's not possible. A very large rock, I like this one, a very large rock from the Snowy Range. Now, many of you know the Snowy Range is just west of Laramie. A very large rock from the Snowy Range sits in the Holiday Inn grounds in Cheyenne. How did that rock get there? And apparently they just left it there and they built a Holiday Inn around it. Now I haven't gone up to find it, but that's what's in the book. And a geologist is telling the author of the book that 85% of the original rocks is missing, it's gone. 85%. Interesting. And a secular geologist goes on and says, when he's standing by the mountains, at least by the Laramie Mountains, he says at least 10,000 feet is gone. Okay? Remind you of anything? Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, which is the breath of life under heaven, and everything that is on the earth shall die. Everything. Where did pivot sprinklers get invented? Anybody know? No farmers here. Birthplace of sprinklers, Strasburg, Colorado. Believe it or not, by Frank Zyback, a tinkerer. He invented the first successful sprinkler in 1947, and that's apparently a picture of what it looked like. Okay? And then the first ones cost $14,000. They're 10 or 20 times that today. Very expensive. And out there they have what they call dinosaurs. You know what a dinosaur is? It's not what we know of as a dinosaur. It's a leftover sprinkler that got wore out and they can't use it anymore. The aluminum pipe that they use for the sprinklers is not recyclable, not good enough to recycle. They just sit there. Find them all over the place laying around. So the towers where that thing was 20 foot tall. Okay? Here's a pivot sprinkler and a beautiful picture. This is just west of Fort Morgan on Graff's turf farm. And there's a pivot sprinkler that the arrow is pointing to. Beautiful. Some of that same turf end up at Notre Dame Stadium, my understanding. This is what a linear irrigation sprinkler system looks like. Have I ever seen one of those? Yep. We have a lot of them out there. There's just not enough room to put one. With this particular picture I took, there wasn't enough room to put a pivot sprinkler in because just the other end of the line here, I didn't show the picture, but the other end of the sprinkler here is a railroad track. So he's kind of got limited real estate or acreage that he can put one. But what happens, this guy drags a hose until he comes to the end, and I was at the end. And so what they do to go back the other way, they take that hose, disconnect it, drag it around here and hook it up to this end and say, okay, now you go that way. And it goes that way, it sprinkles. Fascinating system to see it work. Okay. So efficiency, let's look at efficiency of plant irrigation, just from a perspective of, say, the corn stalk that's there. 40 to 60% is 40 to 60% of flood irrigation, where you just open the floodgate and let the water go down the row and water. It's only 40 to 60%, but when you add a sprinkler to it, it jumps to 80%. But then there's drip irrigation. Not many people here are doing drip irrigation. I saw drip irrigation when I was in Spain, where they were irrigating the grape crop to make wine. Okay, but then there's something called subsurface irrigation, and it's what we also have out there in our area, and that's 95% efficient. We'll talk about that here a little bit here. So this is what a schematic of, say, the subsurface irrigation system is. So you have water that comes in from a supply, goes into this little structure here, and then they have tubes. And now we're looking endwise, so we're looking down a row of corn or whatever it is that's growing here, and there's tubes run down underneath these rows, but they're well below the root zone. But then the water level rises and goes down and down a bit and then rises, and so they're watered from the bottom. There's nothing that goes out to the atmosphere other than what evaporation you get from the plant itself. So it's very extremely efficient, as I mentioned. Okay, and they also then have the ability with this thing to at some point reverse things and drain the water and drain it out of that line, drain it back, and goes into a sump or a hole someplace to store it. This is what it looks like when you look at the top. Not much to see. You got some pipe sticking up over here. You get a pipe. This pipe, all it does is says, "Don't hit me, I'm here." That's all that's for. Okay, and that's the real workings right here. And right on top, you can't see this, but that's a valve here, and there's a valve over there where they can turn it on or turn it off. So the farmer drives down the road, turns it on, water goes underground, you can't see anything. All you see is the corn growing, and it's growing very nicely out there. And the ground is so nice and soft because I walked out in the cornfield, and oh, that felt so good in my feet. No. Nice. Cool. All right, this is what it looks like close up. Oh, there's those valves I was talking about right here. So this one you got it apparently turned on for going this direction, and this one's got it turned off for the water going that direction. I don't know what these two are doing there. They're capped off. But anyway, so where can you see the Ogallala Aquifer Formation right now? 200 feet down? Nope. I drove out east of Brush towards Akron, where I was told, according to the book, again, Ogallala Blue, that you could see it. So I went out, I knew where there's a railroad cut. And so I went down the railroad cut, and I walked over to it. There it is. Ogallala Rock Formation. Really? That's where I first discovered it. So the book said it was, and sure enough, that must be what it is, because there's nothing around that looks like it. It's weird looking stuff, and you've got some up front here. So I took it to my friend Jim. I says, "Jim, I got some Ogallala Aquifer rock here." And Jim being Jim, "Paul, you just got a piece of cement. Where'd you get this stuff?" Well, that's what it looks like. Okay. Ash Hollow State Park, northwest of Ogallala, Nebraska, is where you can see the Ogallala, and that's where N.H. Dalton saw his, and that's what it looks like. You pick them up right off the top of the ground. It looks like a piece of cement. Okay, there's more of it. Just laying there on top of the ground, you can see. So it was a discovery for him and made him famous. Okay. Also, you can go to Ray, Colorado, which is straight east of Brush, where I live, about 70 miles, and there's a bluff, Ogallala Formation. Again, this time it's exposed up in the air. I don't know how far down it goes. This is what it looks like up close. I've got a piece of it over here under, there's a plastic bag over there, and that's from Ray. I had it, the bag is labeled. And even though Pawnee Buttes, which I've spoken on maybe here before, at the top of Pawnee Buttes, Ogallala Formation. Amazing. Just north of Pawnee Buttes is a rock outcrop I call Holy Rocks. And it's an interesting place. I call it Holy Rocks because it's got holes in it. It's got holes in it. I had Holroyd over there, Dr. Ed Holroyd, with me, was up there, and I said, "I want you to look at these things. Paul, that's nothing but a cement dump." I says, "No, it's not it. That's not a cement dump. There's no tracks, there's no way for them to get in and out. This is, I believe it's Ogallala rock. And that hole goes right straight through. It's about 10 inches or so. Okay, 12 inches. It's a long tunnel. And there's a lot of them just with holes like that. And here's other forms, evidence of something was there. And this is on Lift's Bluff across the valley from Pawnee Buttes. Evidence of plant life that rotted out after 4,000 some years. That's where they lay. And I look at the Ogallala rock and what's in it, and reading what they talk about the book, because the author of that book spent a lot of time with drillers, water drillers, And he'd say that they would drill down and would go onto this table, a screen table, and they pull out some things. I think he called them coriander seeds, but they were petrified coriander seeds. You would find those in there as well. And he says there's all kinds of debris, sticks, and everything else that comes up from drilling in that process. I wish I could have been there to see that. So I believe the Ogallala Aquifer is a multi-state sized mud flow. This is my thinking. It's mixed up not only with sand, gravel, and rocks, but leftover plant life matter from the flood, just as you see in large, massive floods today. You see a flood, you see stick, you see trash, all kinds of stuff, the same kind of thing. Update in the Ogallala Aquifer today. Here's an update of the 2023 map. You got the areas that it's not so pretty in. It's declined more than 150 feet. Look down here in the West Texas, parts of New Mexico, southwest Kansas, in this area, they've lost this much. This is in feet, water levels that they've lost. But that's not all bad news. There's also some good news. There's some rises. 5, 10, 25, 50 or more. Look at where the rises are, right up here in Nebraska, in the sand hills of Nebraska. Amazing. Right along, especially right in here with the South Platte and the North Platte, or the Platte River, pardon me. South Platte comes in here, North Platte comes in here, and they merge, and then you have the Platte River. And they're making water over here, so it's a pretty amazing thing. Everybody's, a lot of people concerned about it. The government wants it gets in the picture, and the farmers don't like that, of course, because they want to tell them how to irrigate the land, and they don't like them to tell them how to irrigate the land. And so, whether they've been most successful is turning the problem over to the farmers. And when the farmers get involved, then they say, well, we could do this. I'll tell you what, let's all turn off our guns. Okay, this is what a gun is. You have a pivot sprinkler that goes around a field, right? But on the end is this thing that shoots out with a nozzle, okay? They said, well, all turn off the nozzle because that's not exactly efficient. Okay, so all turn it. So that's just one of the things that they've done. There's other things that they volunteer to cut back on water usage. And other things that they're learning, like the subsurface irrigation that I mentioned. That's another thing that's coming out of this. Here in Yuma, Colorado, east of us, east of Brush, about 70 miles, there's a decline of 50 to 100 feet decline there. Okay. One solution for resupplying the aquifer in various states are aquifer recharge ponds. This is something that's been going on for about 20 years. Okay. And this is what they look like. A typical aquifer recharge pond looks like this, just a pond of water. They pump water in it when there's a lot of excess water coming down the river. They pump it in there, okay? And it just sits there. They don't take it out. It sits and percolates back down into the aquifer. So there's a whole bunch of them, like about 20 or 30 of them along the South Platte River. And this is just one typical one, okay? Here's an interesting statistic from the Water Encyclopedia. One truth that no one seems to comprehend is that there is the same amount of water on this earth as the day it was created. Water is not disappearing. Water that irrigates someone's field sinks into the earth to recharge another area. Water that runs into the ocean, percolates underground, and eventually recharges the underground. It's probably true that the center pivot irrigators are pumping it out faster than Mother Nature can recycle it, okay? It would help the situation if the government quit subsidizing farmers, okay? Politicians with an agenda would have us believe, of course, it's climate change. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down, let us kneel to the Lord, our Maker, for he is our God. And we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. The Spirit of the Lord, the Spirit of the bride says, come. Let the one hears say, come. Let the one who's thirsty come. Let the one who wishes take the free gift of life, of the water of life. Thank you very much.
All right, well, let's have some questions and answers. And so if you have a question, let me know. I'll run the mic around to you. Don't say anything until you get the mic in your hand. And then Paul will answer your question. And let's go from there. While we're doing that, could you guys grab the silver plates in the back, and we're just going to surreptitiously pass some plates around, and if you've got any money or change or anything you'd like to donate to Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship, it would be much appreciated. So, any questions?
Hey there. So at the beginning you mentioned the 4 rivers flowing out of the Garden of Eden, and you said that sounds, I think the word you used was artesian. You said that sounds like an artesian aquifer. It didn't really come up. I was wondering what an artesian aquifer is and why you make that correlation.
Artesian water is a type that just comes out of the earth. The water pressure underneath is so extensive, so strong, so to speak, but not so high. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. They can actually pump a hole in the ground, and the water will come up, and it just use that water for irrigation where they're using it. It's a fairly common principle. In some cases, the water just comes out by itself. Okay. So that's what artesian well is, basically. Yeah. There's some that are man-made, some that are natural. That answer your question? Okay.
Yes, on the aquifer decline charts,
Yes.
do you know how long of a time period that takes place in?
That's been going since they've been pumping. So they really started seriously pumping in the 60s and 70s, particularly in the 70s. And so that's when that's been going. There's some places where there's a big lake in Kansas, and I can't remember where it's at. And the Corps of Engineers built this humongous lake because there was water seepage coming out, kind of like we talked about the water coming out of the ground anyway. And they said, we're going to build a lake. I want to make boating and fishing and all kinds of things. And they spent millions and millions of dollars building the dam for everything. Okay, well, it took a number of years to get that done. And of course, it takes a while to get it engineered and the money approved. By the time the money was approved and it was built, totally dry. Nothing in that lake. Yeah. I don't remember the name of it. Yeah.
Dry lake.
Dry lake, yeah.
Is there any aquifers under the ocean?
I'm going to say probably. That's all I know. I'm going to say probably, but we know that 700 miles down, there's a lot of water down there, but it's all locked up. But I'm going to say probably, yes.
So you were talking about where does the name of Ugalala, how do you say it, aquifer come from? I'll do you one better. Where does Ugalala, Nebraska come from?
That's an Indian name. And I don't remember what it means, but it comes from the Indians in that area. I don't know whether it might be the Ogallala Indians. I don't remember that. It's in the book, but I don't remember that particular point. Yeah.
See,
Yeah, Ken or Candy had any question?
you had a question over here before that one.
did we, or it's not? Okay.
Can you clarify, were you saying that you didn't believe that there were valleys in the mountains prior to the flood? You're talking about the flood as a cause of those, but prior to the flood there weren't those? And then somewhat related to that, mountains that are formed by igneous activity, volcanic activity, then you would be implying that a lot of that activity was all post-flood?
There were some mountains prior to the flood, nothing like what we got today, nothing. You know, I've heard numbers like a couple thousand feet maybe, that kind of a thing. So they're fairly rolling, low hills, so to speak. We know there had to be some rises because there was some places on the earth that the water didn't flood until the latter phases of the flood. So it took a while, so there had to be some elevation there as a part of that, but maybe there was some uplifts going on at the same time. But no, there were no mountains prior to flood, significant mountains prior to the flood. Volcanoes were going on certainly immediately upon the beginning of the flood. Massive volcanoes were going on, and they were building their own mountains as a part of that. And those volcanoes continued all during the flood and for years after the flood as well. The things were still trying to get back to some order of equilibrium as a part of that. Of course, they were building, but we have volcanoes going on today. So they really haven't never quit, but the numbers of volcanoes today compared to immediately post-flood are radically different, yeah.
This was a test to make sure I could remember my question, right? You showed pictures of I think you called them the recharge ponds
Yes.
along the Platte River. How fast would the water evaporate as opposed to percolating down to the aquifer?
Oh, if it was filled up, I'm going to make, if on a day like today, it's going to evaporate to the sun, you know, for one. I'm going to guess it would take a month or two, a couple of months for it to go down, maybe even a little bit longer, you know. Depends on the ground underneath it, obviously, what that earth immediately underneath the dam looks like. I discovered here a while back that they're building one of those within the city limits of brush, right by the golf course. And I'm saying, what are you guys doing? Are you making a massive expansion of the golf course? And turns out what it was, yeah, a little bit with the golf course, but they're making one of these same ponds. And in part of it, it's a part of the flood abatement problems because brush, unfortunately, sits in a hole. It's got a history. When we first bought our house in Brush 22 years ago, we had to get flood insurance for it. We had a short mortgage for it. We had to get flood insurance for it from Lloyd's of London. Weird, I know. We did. And paid that mortgage off as our other house got sold and got rid of that, but that was like $1,000 a year for flood insurance. And then 2 years ago, they decided they're going to remark the flood boundaries. So, in spite, we're not even in the floodplain anymore. The whole thing started, just a little bit of history of Brush, because Brush does sit in a hole, and we have a water supply source comes from as far as 60 miles away. Well, there's other creeks that dump into Brush. And one day there was a huge cloudburst right over that collection of creeks, and it brought down came into Brush, and there was a bunch of hay bales that was caught up in that, and there was a railroad trestle that was there, and the hay bales got caught on the railroad trestle, and as a result of that, they built a dam which flooded Brush. Just a little history. It doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about, but anyway. But now they says, okay, it's not as bad as it used to be. We're okay. All right, fine. Another question? Yeah, there's a question over here.
Is there any understanding in schools of what's really going on? Is there any way to get this information to kids and young people?
The best way is to give talks like this. I can give a talk like this. I'm available for giving talks like this. And the best kids to give the talk to, and the ones that are most available, is homeschoolers. But what I've discovered with our group, since we've been going in brush, I looked at homeschoolers as being a people stream, if you want to call it that. We're going to tell all these homeschoolers, we've got this greatest thing since sliced bread, and we're going to amplify everything that you're already learning. And that was the point. They're already learning it. They don't want to come. But what I found out is that all these homeschoolers that I'm involved with anyway, the Christian homeschoolers, have monthly meetings. They get together and they bring in somebody to talk on something, some subject. One day they had Abraham Lincoln impersonator in there. Wonderful, you know. I talked on rocks. I just brought my rock collection. I'm not a geologist, but I got a lot of pretty rocks. We talked about that, okay? But then I've also gave a give presentation, but they're very focused. And he says, Paul, you've got 20 minutes and nothing more. Because then we move over doing arts and craft. So you got to be prepared for that. So that's the way. As far as the public schools, I don't know. One of my thoughts too is to be able to tie into the churches, and that's an obvious one. Okay, and I've not been very successful at, not been successful at all, with the exception of one church, Seventh-day Adventist Church. And they are very gung-ho on creation and learning these things. So it's really exciting for me, and we've got a really small Seventh-day Adventist church school there.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I have 2 questions for you, Paul.
Make them easy.
First, what's that?
Make them easy.
All right, well, unfortunately, the first one is probably not going to be easy.
Okay.
But the second one will be probably very easy. So the first one is, when I was a lot younger than I am now, I was riding my bicycle across western Kansas and meeting all the locals, and it was a very exciting trip because one day we met these guys who were, I'm not exactly sure what they were doing. They were moving through and taking care of the farms. So some of them were plowing fields and harvesting or planting or something like that.
Yeah, we just had the harvest crew pull through brush this morning.
Yeah.
And they're heading north. Fun to watch.
So I was talking to one of these guys, because when you're on a bicycle, you know, you can stop and talk to people. If you're in a car, you can't do that. But these guys were just out there. We were just out there, so we stopped and started talking to them. And this guy was working on a well. This well was coming up. There was water coming out of this thing. It was a pipe about that big around, you know, maybe 9 inches in diameter or something like that.
Yeah.
And there was water gushing out of that into a little trough that was going off into the field to water everything. So I started asking him about that, and I said, well, where does that water come from? And he said, well, it comes from the Arbuckle. And I said, well, how deep is that? And he said, about 4,000 feet down. And from your talk, it sounds like the Ogallala is nowhere near that deep.
No.
So my question is, have you ever heard of the Arbuckle?
I have heard of that someplace.
Okay.
But maybe isn't there an Arbuckle Mountains or something like that?
Yeah, there are the Arbuckle Mountains.
And that's where I've heard the word.
Okay.
But remember, there's also aquifers, and then there's sometimes a impermeable layer, Then there's another aquifer below that,
Yeah,
and maybe there's one that he's referring to.
that was exactly my question.
Yeah.
So it probably was one from one of those deeper aquifers that was below
Yeah.
a layer. Okay, the next question I have is,
This is the easy one, right?
this is the easy one, yeah. If everybody would be willing to put up with this, assuming Paul's willing to give an answer, the question is, would you be willing to come down here and hold up one or two of these rocks and explain to people what they might be looking at if after the meeting they come up and they want to examine the rocks?
Sure. They're
I
very
knew
heavy.
it.
They're very
I knew it
heavy
would
though,
be-
Rob. I hope I don't have to hold them very long. All right. This, I've got several here that I picked up through my travels. I know they're Ogallala, I know that. But if you look at this, it's full of holes. It looks like sponge you buy down at the store. Okay? All right? There's some that are not this porous and they're more dense like this one. Now, what the difference is in geology terms, I have no idea. But they're very porous. You could pour water on it and you can see the water would seep into it a little bit. Okay? Same thing, which I've been fascinating every now and then, I get water on my sidewalk and it soaks in. An interesting oddity to me, you know. There's got to be a relationship there to this kind of stuff, you know. We have one here as an example. This one I just picked up. If you can see, if I get some shadow effect, there's a straight line, and it's right down through here. I mean, I'm going to lay this microphone down and put my pen on it. Right there. So that is a remnant, a fossil remnant, a stick, twig or something, a stick I would say about, you know, 1/4 inch in diameter. And there's some of those. I had one I've lost somewhere in my travels. I had a hole all the way through, and when I would teach the kids, I would take that rock and I took one of my wife's wooden spoons, and I would stick it in there and I would just kind of twirl it around that, you know, got their attention, you know. But it showed that that rock had a hole all the way through it. And originally that was some twig or something that was in there that finally rotted away. And so some of them, well, I'm making a mess now. I'll leave them alone. They're kind of chalky, as you can see. Some of them have little round rocks here in them, embedded in them. I guess that's about all I can say about, you know, I've exhausted everything I know about them, you know. They're rocks.
But water flows through them?
Water flows through them like a sponge. You think it's a sponge. If you take a sponge and you hold it underneath the faucet, your water will eventually run through it, you know. Or if you take and pour water in the sponge and then you hold it, your water will just kind of continue dripping out after a while. And eventually it won't go out anymore until you put a little pressure on it. Put a little pressure on it and it'll come out. And of course, some of that I think probably relates to the Ogallala rock that's 300, 500 feet or maybe 1,000 feet as much down. There's pressure on it, causes it to come out. Okay.
All right, so I guess that completes our meeting.
Thank you, Rob.
Of course, stay around for the announcements.